They became the first 3 orphaned children of the First World War, before the trenches, before the millions of tragic deaths, before the widows, the maimed, and the great empires left in ruins. But to understand these 3 children, almost forgotten by history, it is necessary to go back a few years in time and understand why their father became the heir to an empire that never welcomed him. In fact, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, give the video a like if you enjoy it, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this story. When people talk about the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, it's often assumed that this was always Franz Ferdinand's destiny. It wasn't the emperor. Franz Joseph had only one son, Archduke Rudolf, who had been groomed from childhood to rule, serving as a symbol of the dynasty's continuity. Then, everything fell apart. Rudolf was found dead in Meierling, alongside his lover. The incident, officially ruled a suicide, deeply shook the empire and left irreversible scars on the emperor himself. Without his son, Franz Joseph was forced to name his younger brother Karl Ludwig as heir. But fate intervened once again. Karl Ludwig died suddenly after contracting an infection during a religious pilgrimage. There was no other alternative. Next in line to succeed him was his son, Franz Ferdinand. He was not liked by the court, did not cultivate alliances, and did not fit the traditional profile of a compliant heir either. The emperor accepted this reality, but never with enthusiasm. Franz was introverted, rigid, and deeply distrustful. Private correspondence, court documents, and diplomatic reports, they describe him as a difficult person to deal with, lacking in charisma, and openly critical of the Viennese aristocracy. He criticized the army, foreign policy, and even the Habsburgs themselves. He became unpopular and for many dangerous. The relationship between uncle and nephew was cold, marked by mutual distrust. Franz Joseph saw Franz Ferdinand as unstable. Franz Ferdinand saw the emperor as the symbol of an aging empire. Even so, nothing would provoke as much hostility as what came next. Sophie Chotek was not born to be hated by the court. Before the public humiliations, before the assassination in Sarajevo, she was just a young noblewoman, discreet and almost invisible to those in power. Born in the month of March in 1868, as the daughter of the noble Count Borislav Chotek, she belonged to an old and highly respectable family, with many centuries of loyal service to the Austrian Empire, but she did not belong to a reigning house. And for the Habsburgs, that changed everything. Educated, with discipline, Sophie stood out for her elegance, her calm intelligence, and her discretion, qualities that led her to the position of lady-in-waiting to Archduchess Isabella von Croy, wife of Archduke Friedrich. It was a respectable position, but a secondary one. Sophie was present, but never at the center. It was in this environment that Franz Ferdinand met her during court events organized by Archduchess Isabella. What began as a discreet presence quickly turned into something unexpected. He fell in love, not out of political convenience or dynastic calculation, but for Sophie herself. When it became known that the heir's interest was not in one of the Archduchess's daughters, but in the lady-in-waiting, the scandal was immediate. Sophie was removed, the relationship was denounced, and the court reacted with open hostility. Franz Ferdinand did not back down. For the first time, he stood up to the emperor and the entire Viennese aristocracy for a woman. Franz Joseph resisted for years before authorizing the marriage. Documents from the Hofburg record postponements, warnings, and successive demands. When he finally gave in, he imposed extremely harsh conditions. The marriage would be morganatic. Sophie would never be empress. She could not sit next to her husband at official ceremonies. And their children would be excluded from the line of succession. Sophie accepted everything, out of love, in silence. Even after the marriage in 1900, she continued to be treated as an intruder. At official events, she was placed behind a man. In portraits, sometimes she didn't even appear. The court never forgave her for being loved by the heir. Over the years, however, something unexpected happened, despite the contempt, the humiliations, and the political isolation. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie became a deeply united couple. The marriage, which so many had predicted would be a mistake, turned out to be solid and affectionate, something rare in European aristocracy. At Sophie's side, Franz Ferdinand became a different man. Tired of the constant hostility of the Viennese court, they decided to distance themselves from court life. They spent most of their time living in Bohemia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, near Prague. There, far from the poisonous gazes of the court, they built something rare among the Habsburgs, a true family life. The couple's 3 children were born in Konopiste. The residence became a space of domestic routine, children's games, walks through the gardens, and family meals. Contemporary accounts describe Franz Ferdinand as a devoted father, attentive to the children's education and emotional well-being. Sophie was always close by, protective, present. Precisely for that reason, Sarajevo would have a special meaning. It was a rare occasion when Sophie could officially accompany her husband, being seen at his side as his wife without humiliation. However, even today, one question remains without a definitive answer. Why? Was it specifically during that visit that security was significantly scaled back? Later documents and accounts clearly suggest that warnings had been made about the risk of an attack in Sarajevo. Even so, basic protection measures were ignored. The escort was minimal, the route was made public in advance, and many members of the high nobility and the official entourage left the city the day before, leaving the heir practically exposed. Even stranger was the fact that Sophie, who almost never had permission to officially accompany her husband, was authorized precisely that day to sit beside him in the open car. An unprecedented concession, a belated and fatal gesture. The visit was not cancelled. None of this proves a formal conspiracy, but the series of decisions, the negligence, the indifference, the carelessness, raises an uncomfortable doubt. Had the empire really done everything possible? Everything to protect an heir who was never loved and a wife who was never accepted? The visit took place in an explosive context. Bosnia had been annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1908, fueling the resentment of Serbian nationalists and of young Bosnians who dreamed of uniting the South Slavic peoples. Among them was Gavrilo Princip, a poor, radicalized student connected to revolutionary circles associated with the secret organization known as the Black Hand. For these young men, Franz Ferdinand was not just a man, he was a symbol, the symbol of Austro-Hungarian rule, a threat. Franz Ferdinand advocated for internal reforms that could weaken the Serbian nationalist project by granting greater autonomy to the peoples of the empire. For the radicals, this made his death even more urgent. The initial plan failed. A bomb was thrown and missed its target. But a series of mistakes, confusion, and poorly communicated decisions put the couple directly in the path of Gavrilo Princip. That day, Sophie was in the car because, for the first time, she had been allowed to be there. She was not the target, but she died as if she were. When Franz Ferdinand was hit, Sophie leaned over him, trying to protect him. She was struck seconds later. She died as she had lived, by his side. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were assassinated. The funeral was discreet and did not take place in Vienna. This was strange because he was the heir to the empire. Stranger still, Emperor Franz Joseph did not attend, nor did most members of the high aristocracy, and likewise, foreign heads of state were absent. Even so, the strict protocol was observed. Even in death, Sophie continued to be treated as inferior, the same treatment that caused the tensions that followed them in life. The coffins were arranged unevenly. Franz Ferdinand's was slightly elevated. Sophie's was lower. Even in death, the morganatic hierarchy was respected. Franz Ferdinand had expressed the wish to be buried next to his wife, something impossible in the Habsburg imperial crypt. The emperor agreed to grant that final wish. The couple was buried in Artstetten, a joint rest that the court never granted them in life. The assassination triggered a chain of alliances, ultimatums, and declarations of war. Within a few weeks, Europe was in flames. Millions would die. Millions would become widows, orphans, and the maimed. But before all of them, there were 3 children. 3 children who lost their father and mother in the same instant. 3 lives forever marked by a political crime. According to historical accounts, Franz Ferdinand was still able to utter his last words to his wife. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live to take care of our children." But Sophie Chotek was already dead, and minutes later, he would die as well. Those 3 children would never see their parents again. Following the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek in June, their 3 children, Sophie von Hohenberg, Maximilian von Hohenberg, and Ernst von Hohenberg, suddenly became orphans overnight. The children were graciously taken in by the family's loyal and close friend, Prince Jaroslav von Thun, and they initially continued living at Konopista Castle in Bohemia, near Prague. This was the very place where they had lived their happiest years during the First World War, despite the eventual collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were not directly affected by the specific Austrian laws against them, since, due to their parents' morganatic marriage, they were never considered full members of the imperial dynasty. However, with the end of the war and the creation of the new state of Czechoslovakia, the situation changed quite drastically. Czech nationalism came to see any connection with the former Habsburg rulers as a clear symbol of occupation and oppression. In 1919, the Czech government expelled the 3 brothers from their ancestral home, allowing them to take only a few of their personal belongings. Deprived of their childhood home, most of their income, and even the right to move freely around the region, the so-called Sarajevo orphans entered adulthood marked by exile, loss, and an instability that would follow them for decades. Ernst von Hohenberg was born in May 1905 in Konopist and was the youngest of the 3 children when his parents were murdered in Sarajevo. He was only 10 years old enough to understand the tragedy, but too young to overcome it from that day on. His childhood was over. After the attack, Ernst joined his siblings under the guardianship of Prince Jaroslav von Thun, until the expropriation of their properties in Bohemia forced them to leave. Eventually, the entire family moved to Vienna and later to the historic Artstetten Castle in Lower Austria, where they desperately tried to rebuild a quiet life that history kept insisting on dismantling. A naturally reserved and quiet individual, Ernst grew up deeply marked by his tragic early loss. He studied forestry as his father specifically wished, preparing himself to manage lands that were repeatedly taken from him by political events and upheavals. Although he led a discreet life, he never hid his monarchist convictions or his rejection of the extremism that was advancing across Europe in March 1938. With the Anschluss, those positions became dangerous. Ernst had participated in pro-monarchy meetings and had publicly spoken out against Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria. That was enough to make him an enemy of the regime. He was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to the Dachau concentration camp, along with his brother Maximilian, without trial or formal charges. After a period in Dachau, Ernst was transferred to Sachsenhausen and later to Flossenbürg. During all those long years, he endured forced labor, starvation, and constant illness. Unlike his brother, he was not classified as a political prisoner, but as a common criminal, a status that meant even more brutal and severe treatment. During his captivity, the family received only sporadic postcards, which contained only his prisoner number, the only proof that he was still alive. Shortly before his imprisonment on May 25, 1936, Ernst had married Marie-Thérèse Wood. She was the daughter of an English diplomat. In 1937, their first son, Franz Maximilian, was born, which would be his last great joy before his final collapse. He was released only in 1943, after a period of intense international pressure, and Ernst left the concentration camps profoundly weakened. Although he managed to survive, he never fully regained his health. After the end of the war, the family's Austrian properties were returned, but Ernst's body and spirit had already been irreversibly scarred. He lived only a few more years, trying to be a father, a husband, and an ordinary man, despite the physical and psychological scars of captivity. On March 5, 1954, Ernst von Hohenberg died in Graz at the age of 49. He was buried in the Hohenberg family crypt at Archstetten Castle. Maximilian von Hohenberg was born on September 29, 1902. Under normal circumstances, he would have been prepared to inherit one of the greatest empires in Europe. If it hadn't been for his parents' morganatic marriage, Maximilian would have been the direct successor to the Austro-Hungarian throne. But history decided otherwise. Before he could even understand the weight of that exclusion, he lost everything: his father, his mother, and the world he would have belonged to. At just 11 years old, Maximilian was left an orphan, and quietly became the head of a family that no longer had a place at the center of power. From an early age, he felt the weight of responsibility. Unlike his younger brother Ernst, who turned inward, Maximilian developed an austere attitude, austere, reserved, marked by discipline and a sense of duty. The trauma did not break him, it made him stronger. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the expulsion of the family from Bohemia, Maximilian tried to build a life that had never been intended for him. He studied law, graduated from the University of Graz, began working as a lawyer, acquired property, and organized family life. And he discreetly assumed the role of head of the House of Hohenberg. He was a man divided between two worlds, too strong to be just a victim, but deprived of everything he should have inherited. Politically, Maximilian never accepted extremism. He was a monarchist, a defender of Austrian independence, and an opponent of Nazism. When, in March 1938, Austria was annexed to the Third Reich, he did not remain silent and paid the price for it. Almost immediately, Maximilian was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to the Dachau concentration camp, along with his brother Ernst. There was no trial or formal accusation, only punishment. In Dachau, the son of the murdered heir to the empire cleaned latrines under the orders of men who represented everything he despised. The humiliation was deliberate, symbolic. Even so, according to later testimonies, Maximilian maintained his dignity, helped other prisoners, and endured captivity without ever begging for mercy. After about 6 months, he was released, not because his innocence was recognized, but because, for political convenience, He was placed under house arrest at Artstetten Castle. The family's remaining properties were confiscated again. Even so, he survived the regime that tried to erase him. With the end of the war, something unexpected happened. Austria was occupied, destroyed, and leaderless. Of course, in Artstetten, the local people knew Maximilian not as a distant aristocrat, but as someone who had suffered, resisted, and persevered. With the approval of the Soviet occupation authorities, he was elected mayor of the town. He governed for 2 consecutive terms, not as the heir to an empire, but as the administrator of a community. On the 16th of November in 1926, Maximilian married Elisabeth von Walberg, who belonged to a noble family considered fully equal by Habsburg standards. The couple had 6 children. He tried to give them what he himself had not had since 1914, stability. But Maximilian's health never fully recovered. Like his mother and his brother Ernst, he suffered from heart problems. In January 1962, shortly after the Christmas celebrations, his condition worsened rapidly. He was rushed to Vienna. Unfortunately, it was already too late. On January 8th, in 1962, Maximilian von Hohenberg tragically passed away at the age of 59. He was buried in the Hohenberg family crypt at Artstetten Castle. The man who could have been emperor ended his life as a country nobleman, a former concentration camp prisoner, and the mayor of a small town. He lived in the shadow of a throne that never existed for him, and now only she remained. Sophie von Hohenberg came into the world in July 1903 at Konopiste Castle, located in Bohemia. She was the firstborn and eldest daughter of Franz, Ferdinand, and Sophie, the only girl among 3 children raised completely removed from imperial pomp, but surrounded by an unusually affectionate family life. Konopiste was the place where her parents felt free from the hostility of the Viennese court. There, Sophie lived a childhood marked by stability, domestic routine, and the constant presence of her father and mother. Franz never had any illusions about the political future of his children. Because of the oath imposed by his morganatic marriage, he knew that none of them would inherit the throne. And according to later accounts by Sophie herself, he raised the children to understand that they were nothing special. He wanted them to live as country landowners, far from the court, protected from dynastic intrigues. He was a firm, demanding father, but profoundly fair, and he wished for his daughter a simple and happy life, alongside someone she loved. That childhood ended abruptly on June 28, 1914. Sophie was 13 years old when she lost her father and mother in the Sarajevo attack. Together with her siblings and new guardians, they continued to live in Konopiste for some time, surrounded by memories that became increasingly painful. After the end of the First World War, tragedy took on a new form among them. The newly created state of Czechoslovakia confiscated the family's various and extensive properties in Bohemia, including the iconic castles of Konopiste and Klumetz. Sophie was expelled from the place she considered her true home. She moved with her siblings to Vienna, beginning a life marked by displacement, material losses, and the constant feeling of never fully belonging anywhere. During the trial of those responsible for the murder of their parents, only one of the accused, Nedelko Chabrinovich, expressed remorse. Upon learning of this, Sophie and Maximilian decided to write him a letter. They confirmed that they were aware of his apology and that he could have a clear conscience, as they forgave him for the role he had played. Regarding the death of their parents, Ernst refused to sign. The letter was personally delivered to Chabrinovich by a Jesuit priest in January, when the siblings were informed of his death. On September 8, 1920, Sophie married Friedrich von Nostitz-Rieneck. As the wife of a Czech citizen, she was able to return to the country where she had spent her childhood. The couple had 4 children. Motherhood became the center of her life. But not even there did history spare her. 2 of her children died as a direct consequence of the Second World War. One in combat, the other after years of Soviet captivity. Sophie, who had lost her parents as a child, also had to bury her adult children. In 1938, tragedy once again haunted the family. Her brothers, Maximilian and Ernst, were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. Sophie witnessed everything from afar, powerless, fearing every day that she would never see them alive again. After the war, the persecution did not cease completely. In 1946, the Czech authorities mistakenly classified Sophie as a Habsburg and once again confiscated her husband's property. She was expelled from Bohemia for the second time, leaving in a refugee truck with her youngest children. Their destination was once again Artstetten Castle in Austria, the same place where years earlier her parents had been buried. Widowed since 1973, Sophie led a quiet life in her later decades, surrounded by faded photographs of an almost legendary past. In 1981, she returned to Konopishche for the first time in 60 years. She walked through the various places of her childhood and calmly declared that she had been genuinely happy there. Sophie von Hohenberg died on October 27, 1990, at the age of 89. She was buried next to her husband in the family crypt. She had lost her parents, her 2 brothers, 2 children, and her husband. She survived empires, wars, and exiles. She lived long enough to see her parents' story portrayed in film. She outlived her siblings by many years and was the last living link to that tragic day that changed the course of the world. The Sarajevo assassination, where not only an heir and his wife died, but also a cycle of violence was set in motion that would lead to the deaths of millions across the globe.